Hey everyone, ready for a deep dive into something pretty fascinating, the psychology of a fool.
Should be interesting.
It really should be. You guys have sent in some really interesting stuff on this.
Yeah,
Especially that article, The Psychology of a Fool, Understanding the Mindset of Self-Destruction.
right,
And we're not just going to define, what foolishness is,
right.
but we're going to really try to get into the why behind it.
Yeah,
And then hopefully give you
yeah,
some practical takeaways, for yourself.
absolutely. It's going to be fascinating, I think, because, everyone's encountered a fool
Right.
at some point in their life. But to actually understand, what makes them tick,
Right.
it can be surprisingly insightful.
Absolutely. So we've got that article plus some of your own notes, and it seems like you're really focusing on kind of the work aspect of this, which is great because we can make this,
Yeah,
super relevant to you.
exactly.
The first thing that really jumped out at me was that idea of fools repeating mistakes or just blatantly ignoring them.
Right.
Why do you think that is?
Well,
It can't just be a lack of intelligence, right?
you're absolutely right. The article emphasizes that, intelligence isn't really the defining factor here.
Right.
It's more about mindset.
Okay.
Those ingrained patterns of thought and behavior
Right.
that lead someone down that path of,
Yeah.
foolishness, and those repeated mistakes.
Yeah.
Often it's because they're not even recognizing them as mistakes in the first place.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so let's get into some of those defining characteristics then. The article mentions arrogance without competence, which I think we've all seen firsthand.
For sure.
This is the person who acts like they know everything, but their actual experience just doesn't back it up.
Yeah.
You mentioned this in your notes, dealing with these kinds of personalities at work. Any specific examples come to mind?
Oh, definitely. There's this one colleague
Uh-huh.
who constantly shoots down others' ideas,
Yeah.
claiming that they're, outdated or ineffective.
Right, right.
Yet his own proposals really lack substance and, they haven't yielded any positive results.
Yeah.
It's like he's built this facade of expertise without any real foundation.
Oh, that's classic.
Yeah.
Classic arrogance without competence right there in action. And what's so frustrating is they often don't even realize they're doing it.
Right.
They genuinely believe they're right,
Totally.
which just makes it all the more difficult.
Exactly. And because their ego is so deeply intertwined with this perceived expertise.
Right.
Any challenge to that is seen as like a personal attack.
Totally. Yeah.
This is where that other characteristic comes into play.
Okay.
Ignoring reality.
Okay.
They cling to these beliefs even when they're presented with, clear evidence to the contrary.
Right. It's like they're living in their own little world detached from the actual facts and feedback.
Totally.
And from your notes, it seems like this is where things can get particularly tricky, in a professional setting, especially if this person is, in a position of authority.
Absolutely. If you have someone in a leadership role
Yeah.
exhibiting these traits, it can really create a toxic work environment.
Right.
Where people are afraid to speak up,
Right.
share ideas, or, challenge the status quo.
Totally.
And that's just a recipe for disaster.
Right.
Both for individual growth
Right.
and the success of the organization as a whole.
Totally. So arrogance without competence, ignoring reality, those are two big ones. But there's another one that the article mentions that's equally detrimental, and that's the blame game.
Right.
These are the folks who just never take responsibility for their actions. It's always someone else's fault.
Oh, yeah.
Always some external factor that's holding them back. What do you think is at the root of that kind of behavior?
I suspect it often stems from a deep-seated fear of failure.
Oh, okay.
A fragile ego that can't handle
Right.
the plart of admitting fault.
Right.
So by shifting the blame outward, they're essentially protecting themselves
Right.
from having to actually confront their own shortcomings.
Right, yeah.
So it's a defense mechanism,
Yeah.
but one that ultimately prevents them from learning and growing.
That makes so much sense. And it creates this vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
Because they never acknowledge their own mistakes. They can't learn from them, so they're just doomed to repeat them.
Exactly.
And it just further reinforces that victim mentality.
It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Wow.
But there's another aspect of this that I find particularly interesting,
Yeah.
and it's the impact it has on their decision-making.
You're talking about that short-term thinking that the article highlights?
Exactly.
That tendency to prioritize immediate gratification
Yeah.
over long-term consequences?
Exactly, because they're not thinking about the bigger picture.
Right.
They're more likely to make impulsive decisions that feel good in the moment.
Right.
but have disastrous implications down the line.
Right, and this isn't just about, indulging in a little too much fun or splurging on that fancy gadget they can't really afford. From your notes, it seems like this can have serious repercussions, in the workplace, especially when it comes to like projects and deadlines.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, imagine someone
Yeah,
who consistently chooses, that quick and easy solution, cutting corners to meet a deadline
yeah,
without considering, the potential impact on quality
right,
or long-term sustainability.
totally.
That's where things can really go wrong,
Yeah.
leading to costly rework, damaged reputation, and, missed opportunities for real innovation.
It's like they're constantly putting out fires
Well,
instead of addressing the underlying issues,
exactly.
which can be exhausting for everyone involved.
It is, and it brings into the final characteristic the article mentions,
Okay.
resisting growth.
Okay.
This is the person who's completely closed off to feedback, new ideas, or any suggestions that might require them to step outside their comfort zone.
So even if you try to offer like constructive criticism or present a different perspective,
Yeah,
they're just not receptive to it.
Yeah.
They're stuck in their ways, convinced that their way is the only right way.
totally.
I'm curious, have you encountered this kind of resistance to growth in your work?
Unfortunately, yes. I once had a manager who was completely resistant to any new technology or methodology. He was convinced that the way things had always been done was the best way,
Oh, wow.
despite the fact that we were falling behind competitors
Right.
and struggling to keep up with industry trends.
That's a perfect example of how this can be detrimental, not just for the individual, but for the whole team
Yes.
or organization.
Absolutely.
It stifles innovation, limits potential, and just creates a culture of stagnation.
Exactly. And, it's often fueled by that same fear of failure
Right,
and fragile ego we were talking about earlier.
right.
Because acknowledging the need for growth
Yeah.
implies acknowledging a current state of inadequacy, which can be a threat to their self-image.
Wow. Okay, so we've got this cluster of characteristics: arrogance without confidence, ignoring reality, blaming others, short-term thinking, and resisting growth. And they all seem to be interconnected,
Yes.
feeding into each other, creating this downward spiral of foolishness.
Right.
But I'm curious, what's at the root of all of this? What makes someone prone to these patterns of thinking in the first place?
Well, that's where things get really interesting. The article points to a fascinating psychological phenomenon called the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Oh, okay. Now I'm intrigued. Tell me more about this Dunning-Kruger effect. What is it, and how does it relate to the psychology of a fool? So you were about to explain this Dunning-Kruger effect. What is it,
Sure.
and how does it tie into all of this?
Well, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a cognitive bias
Okay.
where people with low competence in a particular area, they vastly overestimate their abilities.
Right.
So essentially, they're not skilled enough to even recognize their own incompetence.
Wow, that's fascinating. And a little scary, to be honest. It explains so much about the situations where you're dealing with someone who's like completely confident in their abilities, yet their actual performance is subpar, to put it mildly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the article highlights how this plays out in a few key ways. First, because they lack the necessary knowledge or experience.
Right.
They're often blind to their own mistakes.
Okay.
They simply don't have the framework to identify what they're doing wrong.
It's like they're missing those crucial pieces of the puzzle, so they can't see the complete picture, let alone understand where the pieces don't fit.
Right. And then there's the ego factor.
Okay.
Even if someone were to point out their mistakes, their pride often prevents them from acknowledging them.
Oh, right.
Admitting they're wrong would be a blow to their self-image, so they double down on their flawed beliefs and behaviors.
That defensiveness really makes it difficult to have a productive conversation, let alone guide them towards improvement. It's like hitting a brick wall every time. And from your notes, it seems like this can be a real obstacle in, collaborative work environments.
Absolutely. The Dunning-Kruger effect can really hinder teamwork and innovation.
Okay.
Imagine you're working on a project
Right.
with someone who's convinced they have all the answers, but their ideas are actually misguided
Yeah.
or impractical. It can create a lot of frustration
Yeah.
and wasted effort
Totally.
if they're unwilling to listen to others' perspectives or consider alternative approaches.
Right, and the article mentions that people affected by the Dunning-Kruger effect often dismiss actual experts.
Yes,
Because they genuinely believe they know better.
that's right. They might see someone with, years of experience and proven success,
Right.
but because of their own inflated sense of competence, they dismiss that expertise as irrelevant or outdated.
Right.
It's like they're trapped in this bubble of self-delusion. unable to recognize the value of true knowledge and experience.
This all makes so much sense now. It's like the Dunning-Kruger effect is like the fuel that drives so many of those foolish behaviors.
Right.
But the article also talks about emotional impulsivity, this tendency to be ruled by emotions rather than logic. How did that fit into this whole picture?
Well, emotional impulsivity is a key player in the psychology of a fool.
Okay.
It's that inability to regulate their emotions,
Okay.
which leads to, rash decisions,
Right.
outbursts of anger, and just a general lack of self-control.
So instead of taking a moment to pause, reflect, and consider the potential consequences of their actions, they just react impulsively, driven by whatever emotion is gripping them in that moment.
Yeah,
I can definitely see how this ties into that short-term thinking we were talking about earlier.
absolutely. I mean, imagine someone who's driven by fear.
Right.
They might make a hasty decision based on their anxieties
Yeah.
without really considering the long-term implications.
Right.
Or someone fueled by anger might lash out at a colleague,
Right.
damaging a crucial working relationship.
Right. And in those moments, it's like logic just goes out the window.
Totally.
They're so consumed by their emotions
Yeah.
that they can't think clearly or rationally.
Exactly. And this ties back to the Dunning-Kruger effect. It's often that inflated sense of self-importance.
Right.
That belief that they're always right.
Yeah.
That fuels these impulsive reactions. They simply can't handle the blow to their ego that comes with admitting they were wrong.
Right.
Or considering a different perspective.
It's like they're trapped in this reactive cycle,
Yeah.
driven by their emotions, blinded by their own ego. But there's one more root cause the article highlights that I think is especially relevant to your situation: the fear of responsibility.
Ah, yes, the victim mentality.
Okay.
This is where individuals consistently refuse to take ownership
Right.
of their lives and their choices.
Right.
Instead, they blame others for their failures, complain about their circumstances without taking any action to change them, and they constantly make excuses instead of searching for solutions.
And this can be particularly insidious in a work environment if someone is constantly blaming their colleagues, their boss, or the company for their own lack of progress.
Yeah,
It just creates this toxic atmosphere of negativity and resentment.
absolutely. And it prevents them from truly learning and growing
Right.
because they're always looking outward for the source of their problems.
Right.
They never do the internal work necessary
Yeah.
to improve their skills, develop their talents,
Right.
or really take ownership of their career trajectory.
So we've got these three powerful forces at play: the Dunning-Kruger effect, emotional impulsivity, and the fear of responsibility. And when they combine, it's like a recipe for disaster, right? They fuel those foolish behaviors, those repeated mistakes, and that ultimate self-sabotage.
Exactly. But it's important to remember that, we're not just exploring these concepts for academic purposes here.
Right.
We're trying to understand them
Right.
so we can recognize them in ourselves and in others
Yes.
and ultimately avoid falling into those same traps.
That's a great point. It's about self-awareness, about understanding those potential pitfalls so we can navigate them more effectively.
Exactly.
But I'm curious, what are the real-world consequences of this foolish thinking? I mean, how does it actually play out in people's lives?
Well, that's where things get a little more serious. The article paints a pretty stark picture
Okay.
of how foolishness can lead to failure
Yeah.
in various aspects of life.
Okay, let's get real about the consequences then. What are we talking about here? So we've got these three big factors: the Dunning-Kruger effect, emotional impulsivity, and that fear of responsibility. It sounds like these can really set someone up for failure
Yeah, for sure.
in a lot of areas of their life.
The article emphasizes that foolishness isn't just some harmless personality quirk.
Right.
It can have real-world consequences
Right.
that ripple through every aspect of a person's life,
Right.
especially in the workplace.
You've mentioned some potential pitfalls in your notes too, right?
Definitely.
Things you've observed firsthand.
Yeah, one of the biggest consequences I've seen is the breakdown of relationships,
Okay.
both personal and professional.
Right.
I mean, think about it. If someone is constantly blaming others, refusing to acknowledge their mistakes, and resisting growth,
Yeah.
it's going to create friction and resentment.
It's like they're pushing people away.
Yeah,
Even those who genuinely care about them and want to see them succeed.
totally.
And in a workplace setting, that can be really detrimental to teamwork, collaboration, and overall morale.
Absolutely. And this can lead to another major consequence: missed opportunities.
Okay.
When someone is stuck in that cycle of foolish thinking, they often fail to recognize or capitalize on opportunities
Right.
for growth and advancement.
Yeah.
They might be offered a promotion but turn it down because they're afraid of failing or taking on
Yeah.
new responsibilities.
Right.
Or they might have a brilliant idea for a new project,
Mm-hmm.
but never share it because they're convinced it's not good enough.
Right.
or they're worried about being criticized.
It's like they're sabotaging their own success,
Mhm.
blinded by their own insecurities and those self-limiting beliefs, and it can be heartbreaking to watch.
It is.
Especially if you see their potential and know what they're capable of achieving.
Right.
If they could just break free from those negative
It
patterns.
really is. And then there's the potential for financial ruin.
Oh, right.
We talked about how impulsivity and short-term thinking can lead to bad financial decisions. But when those tendencies are combined with a refusal to take responsibility or learn from mistakes,
Right.
it can create a recipe for disaster.
It's like that classic scenario of someone who keeps overspending,
Yeah.
racking up debt, and then blaming external factors like
Yeah.
the economy or their low income instead of taking a hard look at their own spending habit
Exactly.
and making necessary changes.
And that financial stress can then spill over into other areas of their life,
Oh, wow.
further exacerbating their problems
Yeah.
and creating a downward spiral that's difficult to escape.
It's like a chain reaction
Yeah.
of negative consequences,
Yeah.
all stemming from that initial seed of foolishness.
Right.
And the article doesn't sugarcoat the ultimate outcome, a life filled with regret.
That's right. The tragedy of a fool is that they often don't see the error of their ways until it's too late.
Right.
They might spend years stuck in a dead-end job, surrounded by broken relationships,
Right.
burdened by financial woes, wondering how they got there.
Yeah.
And it's only then that the weight of their foolish choices truly hits them.
It's a sobering thought, but it's also a reminder of why this deep dive is so important. It's about recognizing those patterns of foolish thinking, both in ourselves and in others,
For sure.
so we can choose a different a path that leads to growth, fulfillment, and a life that we can be proud of.
Exactly. It's about empowering ourselves to break free from those self-sabotaging behaviors
Right.
and create a more positive and fulfilling future.
Okay, enough with the doom and gloom. Let's shift gears and talk solutions.
Sure.
The article offers some great advice on how to avoid the fool's mindset, and it all seems to boil down to cultivating wisdom.
Absolutely. And I think the first step towards wisdom is self-awareness.
Okay,
A fool is blinded by their own ego, convinced they're always right.
right.
A wise person, on the other hand, is willing to question their own assumptions,
Okay,
acknowledge their limitations,
yeah.
and be open to feedback and new perspectives.
So it's about developing that inner critic, that voice that asks, am I really seeing the situation clearly? Am I letting my emotions cloud my judgment? Could I be wrong about this?
Exactly. It's about pausing, reflecting,
Yeah,
and challenging our own beliefs before charging ahead blindly.
right.
And this leads to the next crucial step, taking responsibility.
Okay.
A fool blames others.
Uh-huh.
A wise person owns their mistakes.
So instead of pointing fingers or making excuses, a wise person asks, what role did I play in this situation? What could I have done differently? What can I learn from this experience?
Right. It's about owning your actions and their consequences, both good and bad.
Yeah.
And, this sense of ownership is incredibly empowering because it puts you in control. It means you're not a victim of circumstance.
Right.
You have the power to shape your own destiny.
And you mentioned in your notes that surrounding yourself with the right people is crucial.
Yes.
I've heard that saying, you're the average of the 5 people you spend the most time with. Do you really think that's true?
I absolutely believe it. The company we keep has a profound impact
Right.
on our mindset and behavior.
Right.
If you're constantly surrounded by people who are negative, cynical, and resistant to growth, guess what?
What?
That negativity is going to rub off on you. It's like an infectious disease of the mind.
It's like that saying, misery loves company.
Exactly.
But on the flip side, if you surround yourself with people who are positive, supportive, and growth-oriented,
Yes.
their energy and enthusiasm will inspire you to elevate your own game.
Exactly. It's about choosing your influences wisely. Seek out people who challenge you to be better, who inspire you to think differently, and who support your growth and development.
It's like building your own personal board of advisors, a team of people who will help you navigate the challenges, celebrate the victories, and hold you accountable to your highest potential.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this leads to another key piece of advice from the article: develop long-term thinking.
Okay.
A fool lies to the moment, chasing instant gratification without considering the consequences.
It's like those kids in the marshmallow experiment, right?
Exactly.
They couldn't resist that one marshmallow sitting in front of them, even though they were promised 2 if they waited a little longer.
Exactly. A wise person, on the other hand, understands that the most rewarding things in life often require patience, discipline, and a willingness to delay gratification.
So instead of focusing on what they want right now, they ask themselves, what kind of life do I want to create for myself in the future?
Yeah.
What choices can I make today that will lead me towards that vision?
Right. It's about thinking in years, not days,
Okay.
and being willing to make those short-term sacrifices for long-term gains.
It's like planting a seed and nurturing it patiently, knowing that it will eventually grow into a beautiful tree that bears fruit for years to come. But how do we actually cultivate that discipline, that long-term vision? It's easy to say, think about the future, that putting it into practice can be a whole other challenge.
You're right. It's not always easy, especially in a world that's constantly bombarding us with instant gratification and short-term rewards.
Right.
But I think it starts with setting clear goals,
Okay.
both big and small.
Yeah.
When you have a vision for the future, a destination you're working towards, it becomes easier to make those daily choices that align with that vision.
So instead of, mindlessly scrolling through social media or binge watching TV,
Right.
we could be working on that side hustle,
Yep.
learning a new skill or investing time in our relationships. It's about being intentional with our time and energy, right?
Precisely. It's about prioritizing those activities that contribute to our long-term well-being, even if they're not always the most immediately gratifying. And this ties into another important aspect of long-term thinking: patience.
Ah, yes, the virtue that seems to be in short supply these days. But you're right, patience is essential for achieving those big, audacious goals. Because let's face it, nothing worthwhile happens overnight.
Right.
It takes time, effort, and a willingness to persevere through challenges.
And this is where discipline comes into play. It's the bridge between setting goals and achieving them. It's the ability to show up consistently even when you don't feel like it, and to stay focused on the long game even when faced with distractions and setbacks.
It's about creating those daily rituals and habits that support your goals, even if they're small steps. Maybe it's waking up an hour earlier to exercise or setting aside a specific time each day to work on that creative project. It's about making those consistent efforts that compound over time, leading to remarkable results. But I think it's also important to remember that we're human and we're not going to be perfect all the time. We're going to make mistakes, we're going to have setbacks,
Right.
and there will be times when we fall back into those old patterns of foolish thinking.
Absolutely. We're all works in progress. The key is to be kind to ourselves, to recognize those moments when we're slipping into foolishness, and to gently guide ourselves back on track.
Right.
It's about embracing that growth mindset we talked about earlier, that belief that we can always learn, adapt, and improve.
So instead of beating ourselves up for our mistakes, we can use them as opportunities for growth and learning.
Exactly.
We can ask ourselves, what can I learn from this experience? How can I use this setback to become stronger and wiser?
It's about turning those stumbles into stepping stones,
Yeah.
transforming those moments of perceived failure into valuable lessons
Yeah.
that propel us forward on our journey.
And I think that's a beautiful message to end on. The journey towards wisdom is ongoing.
Yes,
It's filled with twists and turns,
for sure.
and it's unique to each individual.
Absolutely.
But the most important thing is to keep moving forward, keep learning, keep growing, and never stop striving to be the best versions of ourselves.
Beautifully said. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. Seek out those mentors, those role models, those wise individuals who can offer guidance and support along the way.
Yeah.
And, remember those resources you sent in,
Right.
that article, your notes.
Yeah.
Those are valuable tools to revisit as you continue to reflect on these ideas.
That's a great point. This deep dive has given you a framework, but now it's about taking that knowledge and applying it to your own life, your own unique journey.
Exactly. So as you navigate the complexities of your workplace and your personal life, remember those key principles: self-awareness, responsibility, surrounding yourself with the right people, and that long-term vision.
It's been an absolute pleasure diving deep into this fascinating topic with you today. Until next time, keep seeking wisdom and embracing the journey.
Thanks for joining us.